Emotional invalidation is what happens when we're communicating to a person that their emotions are unacceptable or wrong or inappropriate somehow. I talk about this more in depth in this video up here, but basically all emotions are valid in the sense that they reflect that person's reality. You may not agree with the reality that leads to that emotion for them, but if you would also live that same reality, you would probably also experience the same emotion in their shoes. Now, sometimes what can happen with certain emotions is they don't fit the facts of the situation, meaning that person's reality is a distortion of objective reality. But the problem is, though, that you can't go into correcting the facts of their reality before first validating their emotions. Because emotions are messengers. They're trying to send a message to that person. Kind of like how a fire alarm is trying to send a message that, hey, there's smoke in here, you need to check that out, or else the house is going to set on fire. If the fire alarm starts going off and there's not actually a fire, you need to address the fire alarm. Otherwise, the fire alarm is just going to keep beeping and beeping and beeping, and it's going to drive you crazy and you can't do anything throughout your day. It's exactly like that with people's emotions too. If they have this fire alarm going off, really powerful emotion trying to get your attention, you're not going to get any progress until you first address it, until you first acknowledge what message is being brought up by their emotion. Today we're going to talk about emotion invalidation, what it is, how it looks for parents in particular to emotionally invalidate their children, and what a healthier approach looks like. Back in the day, it was very common for parents to use invalidation of their children's emotion as a parenting technique. It was easier than to teach a child how to co-regulate. It was simpler to just say, get over it, or, toughen up. But more recently, research has shown how incredibly damaging chronic emotional invalidation is for people, especially for children who are still developing. For example, chronic invalidation leads to more emotional dysregulation because the child keeps trying to express their emotions in a bigger and bigger way, because clearly the way they tried to communicate it before didn't go noticed. So they keep hoping, okay, if I have a bigger reaction, a bigger emotion, a more disproportionate emotional expression, maybe then my parent will respond to me in a validating way or help co-regulate my feelings. And that is why chronic invalidation, when paired with a genetic predisposition for emotional dysregulation, can result in things like borderline personality disorder. Chronic childhood invalidation is also a risk factor for narcissism, and there have been associations between emotion invalidation and a wide range of pathology, including eating disorders, rheumatic diseases, pain, marital dysfunction, and possibly intergenerational transmission of emotion dysregulation. The mechanism by which it's suspected this works is that anticipating that your parent is going to invalidate you causes stress, and of course increasing chronic levels of stress when you're experiencing a painful emotion sets you up for failure in a number of different ways. Emotion invalidation can also result in emotional inhibition when you are too restrictive with your emotions and you practice avoidance as a coping strategy, which is notorious for being not a very helpful coping strategy, and of course heightens your distress. It has even been said that emotion invalidation in its extreme can be construed as psychological abuse. So there is no question about it. Emotion invalidation can be very harmful for children to experience. But how does it actually look in practice? Often it comes up in a number of dismissive phrases. Some of them are a little bit more shaming, such as don't be a baby, or big girls or big boys don't cry, meant to send the message to children that adults don't have big emotions, which is just not true. Sometimes they're meant to communicate to the child that their emotions are too much or inappropriate somehow. That could sound like saying you're overreacting, you're too sensitive, it's not a big deal. Sometimes emotional invalidation can look like sort of force-feeding resilience down children's throats when they're really not even at a place developmentally when they have the skills to practice resilience the way an adult would. So that can sound like saying to kids, you need to toughen up or just shake it off. Something that, maybe an adult could do in that situation, but a child is definitely going to find very difficult. Sometimes it's just very dismissive, like saying you're fine or you'll get over it. Sometimes emotional invalidation looks a little bit more angry, a little bit more punitive, like saying you don't get to be angry with me or you don't get to express this particular emotion. Sending the message that, especially for children and especially with regards to their parents, they're not not allowed to have certain emotions, calm down or relax. I don't think anyone has calmed down or relaxed after being told to calm down or relax, because adding invalidation to an already painful emotion just makes the reactions so much more painful and so much bigger. Now, in addition to these dismissive phrases that I mentioned, emotion validation can sometimes look like punishing emotion expression. So emotion expression is how a person chooses to express the emotion that they feel. A parent who is invalidating might force their child to regulate themselves before it's developmentally appropriate or without their help, without their scaffolding. For example, sending a child into a timeout to calm themselves down when they're at an age that they can't calm down by themselves. They need their parent to guide them through it. Emotionally invalidating parents will sometimes use what's called positive punishment, which is not what it sounds like. Positive punishment is when you introduce a painful stimulus that the child doesn't want. So, for example, yelling at the child for expressing an emotion, manhandling them, things like that. They can also use something called negative punishment, which is when you take away a stimulus that they do desire. For example, you might withhold affection. That would be an example of negative punishment. Suddenly being very cold to your child because they expressed an emotion that you deem to be not okay. And just generally sending the message that certain emotions are off limits or certain emotions are not okay to feel. Like sometimes parents will tell children, no, we don't hate anybody, or you don't have a right to be angry with me, which is just false. There is a wide spectrum of emotions and they are all normal for all humans to feel in certain situations. Or they'll send the message that having an emotional reaction is a character flaw somehow, when again, an emotion is just a messenger. It's just a fire alarm. It is not an indication of that person's character or worth. We all have emotions. It doesn't make us bad people. Certainly what we can choose to do with those emotions, the way we sometimes express them, can be harmful to other people, and that's something that needs to be addressed, and I'll talk about more in a little bit. But simply having a certain emotion or expressing it in a way that's inconvenient to the parent is not a character flaw. But there's even a more subtle way that parents sometimes invalidate their children, and that is when a parent tries to fix or get rid of a child's painful emotion with things like distractions or rewards, or just generally being unable to sit with that child's emotion and distress. If a parent sees a child is feeling really sad, for instance, because maybe they were left out of a birthday party, they might say, what if we go get ice cream? Would that make you feel better? Kind of trying to put a band-aid over the emotion to just get them to get over it faster. Or a parent might sometimes, with good intentions, try comforting a child, but they'll say things like, oh no, don't be sad, sweetie, mommy loves you so much. Again, sending this message that you shouldn't be sad. You shouldn't be having the emotional reaction that you're having. Or sometimes a parent will try to get the child to see the silver lining of the situation before first processing their underlying feelings of grief. So to give you an example, recently I was talking with a friend of mine about the way that, the political situation in the US is affecting her. And I felt this impulse at one point to be like, oh, well, let's talk about the silver lining, or let me somehow reframe this as something that she could be grateful for, because I was uncomfortable with sitting in her grief, because I was uncomfortable with the fact that I can't take away her pain. But the thing is, that's a form of emotional avoidance. You can't react like that to somebody's painful emotion. If there's a solution, of course, help them see the solution. But when it concerns the emotion itself, you have to be able to sit with people's discomfort without trying to fix it, because doing so will only delay their healing and will only make it harder for them to process through that painful moment. So how does validating co-regulation of emotions look instead between a parent and child? The very first thing is that a parent needs to be what's called empathically attuned, meaning they are in tune with their child's emotions. That means that you can identify that your child is having a difficult emotion, that you can identify which emotion they're having. You can probably speculate about what caused it. You also have a general understanding of emotional intelligence, so you understand what that emotion typically tries to communicate. You understand why they're having this reaction based on the worldview that they hold, based on their reality in that moment. And it's also really important to be attuned to your own emotions, because when a child is having a difficult or painful or big emotion, that can produce a lot of difficult or big or painful emotions in the parent as well, and those cannot be ignored. You cannot support your child in their emotion if you also can't sit with your own feelings of distress produced by their emotion. Now, once you are empathically attuned with your child and you're in touch with your own feelings, it's really important to join the child in their emotion without trying to change their emotional experience whatsoever. That means being physically and emotionally present with them, sending the message that I'm right here with you, both verbally and non-verbally. Try to just sit with the emotion in total acceptance and prompt the child to practice mindfulness. You can ask, what are they feeling in their body as they're feeling this painful emotion? Could they name the feeling? What's going on for them internally, externally, in the moment? And then the really key piece is, of course, validating the child, which is just sending the message that it is all right to have this emotion. That means, first of all, acknowledging the emotion. You could say something like, I can tell you're feeling really angry right now. And it also involves empathizing with them, which sounds like, I'd feel pretty angry too if I were you. Or I imagine I'd feel pretty disappointed in your place. Or I can see why you're upset about that. And only once you've thoroughly validated the child and you get the sense that they fully hear you, can you go into emotion co-regulation. Emotion regulation must happen after the child is validated, because otherwise it's kind of like trying to get someone to function about their day when the fire alarm is still going on full blast. They're not going to be able to function. They need to first turn off the fire alarm. Now, part of helping your child emotionally regulate themselves means that if the way they're expressing their emotion is inappropriate to the situation or disruptive or harmful to other people, it's perfectly fine and even recommended to leave the setting altogether or to set some sort of boundary, right? So if the child is, for instance, hitting people or yelling in a public place or being disruptive somehow, it is completely fine to set a boundary, just in a way that's not overly punitive. So if they're being disruptive, for instance, remove them from the setting. If they're hitting you with a toy, remove the toy from them. Say, that really hurts, don't hit me. And then once you're in a setting where you can practice emotion co-regulation, guide your child through the types of things that adults do. Things like taking deep breaths, using physical touch to feel better, like hugging your child or, patting them on the head or giving them, a little scalp massage. You can guide them through a grounding exercise like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, where you're trying to get them to notice different things in their environment to get them to be more present in the moment. Or sometimes it can be helpful to do the opposite action. For example, if your child is feeling really, really anxious, after you've validated them, if you know, coloring really helps them calm down, you can color together. Or emotion co-regulation can look like problem solving, like thinking, hey, there's actually a simple solution to what's causing you distress. How about we go do that thing that would solve the problem? And after you've co-regulated together, you can debrief as well. It's important to give positive reinforcement for getting through the difficult emotion, even if it is saying something like, you did such a good job, or just generally showing warmth towards the child and sending the message that they did a good thing by working through the emotion. Sometimes, depending on the child's age too, you can ask them, hey, did you learn anything from this experience? Or did you learn something that maybe would help you next time a situation like this comes up? And this is where sometimes maybe it would help to switch a little bit into finding the silver lining or leaning into gratitude. For example, if a kid is really upset that they didn't get to go to a birthday party that they weren't invited to, trying to explain that it is really disappointing. Sometimes it can be a blessing to know who our real friends are. So let me run through an example of a difficult scenario where a child is throwing a temper tantrum and outline what an invalidating response would look like versus what a validating response would look like from the parent. So the situation is you're in a public place, let's say the mall, church, a restaurant, and the child starts screaming and throwing a temper tantrum and, lying on the ground, all that good stuff. An invalidating response would be to start yelling or manhandling the child or withholding affection because you yourself feel embarrassed or angry in that moment. Just generally communicating some version of your emotion or your reaction is unacceptable. If you do that, it's very likely that your child is going to keep throwing a temper tantrum and not overcome it because they do not have the tools to self-regulate. And you as the adult are not helping guide them through it. Versus a validating response would look something more like this. Gently grabbing them by the hand, leaving the setting, going somewhere more private where they're not disturbing other people and they also have space to regulate. Validating the emotion, validating the fact that they're frustrated. Saying, for instance, you're feeling pretty angry right now, right? Or, I understand it made you angry when I said we don't have time to stop by the chocolate shop today. Or, I get it, I sometimes get frustrated when I can't get something I want too. Then you might take some deep breaths together, mindfully move through the emotion, ask your child, what are you feeling? What's going on for you internally? Help me understand, kind of helping them get in touch, get mindful. And at some point after a certain period of co-regulating, the child is going to stop because emotions don't last forever. They don't last forever for adults. They don't last forever for children. At some point, the body tires itself out. And when that's the case, when the child is more regulated, that's when you can, for instance, move into problem solving. So you can say, listen, we can't stop by the chocolate shop today, but how would you like to have chocolate after dinner at home? Now, this is where I think there's a common misunderstanding that if you are validating the child or problem solving or compromising with them, that it somehow means like you're enabling them. But validating a child's emotion doesn't mean letting them get whatever they want whenever they want it. That would be an example actually of giving in to them to avoid the emotion because it makes you uncomfortable for you to see them having that emotion. That wouldn't be an example of emotional validation. And in fact, emotional validation not only is completely compatible with, but must be paired with healthy boundaries. Healthy boundaries meaning you're not completely rigid, you're not completely authoritarian, but you are also setting some parameters of what the child can and can't do. If you don't pair validation with healthy boundaries, what you end up doing instead is enabling or coddling the child. And that also predisposes children to things like narcissism if it's done chronically. So the validation and the co-regulation must be paired with healthy boundaries, with you still being the adult, not letting the child get whatever they want in the moment. And then once the child is regulated enough to return to the setting, express warmth. Try to reinforce that, hey, you got through it. It was a difficult moment, but you did it. Good job. And you can also debrief. You can say, see, look, we found a solution. You can have chocolate after all today. It's just not here at the mall. So that's an example of what a validating response would look like in this situation. I hope that this video gave you some insight into what emotion validation looks like as a parent and why it's so important. Whether you are a parent or a former child, I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments down below, and I'll see you soon.